I stood there, trembling, clutching a $10 million inheritance check in one hand and my signed divorce papers in the other, but my world had already turned to ash. The ink on our separation was still wet when the hospital machines went flat, silencing the only heart that ever truly beat for me. For years, I mistreated his silence as coldness and his distance as betrayal, walking away with a smirk of bitter revenge. But as I opened the bloody briefcase recovered from the crash, the truth shattered my soul. He didn't stop loving me. He spent the last 2 years weaving a web of lies to make me hate him, just so his inevitable death wouldn't break my heart. I won the divorce. I inherited the fortune. But as I scream his name into the empty rain, I realize I've spent 10 years waiting for a future that he was secretly giving up just to set me free. How do I breathe, knowing the man I called my villain was actually my only savior? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The living room was swallowed in shadows, the only light coming from the flickering candles on a 10-year anniversary dinner that had long gone cold. I sat there, my fingers trembling as I gripped a small gift box, a watch I had saved for an entire year to buy for him. Then, the sharp rattle of a key broke the silence. Mark stepped in, but he wasn't alone. A young, radiant woman walked beside him. The scent of her perfume hit me sharp, expensive, and as bitter as the betrayal rising in my throat. "You're late," I whispered, my voice barely holding together. My chest felt like it was being crushed under 1,000 pounds of stone. Mark didn't even look at me. He ripped off his tie and tossed it onto the sofa we had picked out together. 10 years? The contract expires next week, Sarah. Stop wasting your time on these pathetic displays. The girl beside him let out a faint, victorious smirk. My breath hitched. I held out the gift box, my hands shaking so hard I thought I'd break, but he glanced at it as if it were a piece of trash. "I don't need your time anymore," he spat, each word a jagged blade cutting through my decade of devotion. "Clean up this mess. Starting tomorrow, she will be managing my schedule. All of it." He walked straight past me toward the stairs, leaving me standing hollow in the freezing room. I looked down at my hands. The gift box slipped and hit the floor. The glass on the watch shattered instantly, just like the last fragment of my hope. As I knelt to pick up the shards, Mark's phone vibrated on the marble counter. A message flashed from a Dr. Miller. "The seizures will only get worse, Mark. Are you absolutely sure you don't want her to know the truth? I have refined Part 2 to meet the 600 to 650 word requirement, focusing on the sensory details of a high-end American suburban life and deepening the psychological warfare between Sarah and Mark. This version bridges the gap between the anniversary disaster and the shocking discovery in his briefcase with a seamless, haunting flow. Part 2. The echoes of a ghost marriage. The vibration of the phone on the cold marble counter felt like a rhythmic electric shock coursing through my fingertips, a jarring contrast to the suffocating silence Mark left behind as his footsteps retreated up the stairs. My breath hitched, caught in a throat that felt lined with broken glass as I stared at the glowing screen. "Seizures? Dr. Miller?" The words blurred before my eyes, dancing mockingly against the backdrop of our expensive, sterile kitchen, a space I had spent 10 years trying to curate into a sanctuary of warmth, only to realize it was nothing more than a high-end showroom for a failing life. For a split second, a flicker of something other than agony sparked in my chest, an old, conditioned instinct to run to him, to be the shield I had always tried to be. But then, the memory of that young woman's triumphant smirk flashed in my mind, and the spark died as quickly as it had ignited. I pulled my hand back as if the phone had burned me, leaving it there, a glowing omen of a secret I wasn't supposed to witness. I didn't want to care. I wanted to hate him for the way he had just discarded a decade of my life, like a piece of outdated software. Yet, the weight of that message settled in the pit of my stomach like lead, cold and unyielding. I spent the rest of the night on the velvet sofa in our cavernous living room, watching the moon crawl across the ceiling of our Westchester mansion until the gray, unforgiving light of a New York dawn began to bleed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My joints felt stiff, my heart a hollow cavity that echoed with every thud of my pulse. I had spent 3,650 days perfecting the art of being the invisible wife, the woman who managed the estate, silenced the scandals, and kept the bed warm, all while waiting for a thank you that never came. Now, with the contract expiring in mere days, the silence between us had grown teeth, biting into the very foundation of my identity. When I heard the shower run upstairs a sharp, mechanical hiss, I stood up, my legs trembling, and forced myself into the kitchen to perform the ritual one last time. I brewed his favorite Blue Mountain coffee, the rich aroma, usually a comfort but now a sickening reminder of my servitude. Mark descended the stairs at precisely 7:15 a.m., looking as impeccable as ever in a charcoal gray tailored suit, but his face was a mask of calculated indifference that chilled me to the bone. He didn't acknowledge me as he reached for the ceramic mug, his movements sharp and efficient, but I noticed something I hadn't seen in the dim candlelight of the previous night. When his fingers wrapped around the handle, they tremored a fine, persistent shake that he tried to hide by bracing his elbow against the marble island. I watched him, my heart hammering against my ribs, wondering if this was the seizure the doctor had mentioned, or if it was simply the tremors of a man who couldn't wait to be rid of the woman standing in front of him. I opened my mouth to speak, to beg for a shred of the truth, but the words died on my tongue when he finally turned his gaze toward me. His eyes weren't filled with the illness I expected. They were filled with a cold, piercing contempt. "I've instructed the lawyers to have the final post-nuptial dissolution papers ready by noon," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. "I've already moved the last of my things into the guest wing. Don't bother with dinner, Sarah. I'll be out late with Elena. She's helping me finalize the Singapore merger, and frankly, her energy is a breath of fresh air compared to the suffocating, stale air of this house." The cruelty was a physical blow, a deliberate strike to the heart that left me gasping. I watched him set the mug down, barely touched, and walk toward the door without a single backward glance. He was erasing me, centimeter by centimeter, hour by hour. But as the heavy oak door clicked shut, I realized he had forgotten his leather briefcase, the one he usually guarded like a holy relic. I walked over to it, my hands numbing as I reached for the silver latch, driven by a toxic, desperate need to know how much of my life had been a lie. I clicked it open, expecting to find evidence of Elena or hidden offshore accounts. Instead, my breath left me entirely. Tucked into a hidden silk compartment was a thick stack of envelopes, all addressed to me. My heart stopped when I saw the dates written on the top right corners. They weren't from the past. They were dated for every single day of the next 6 months, beginning the day our contract officially ended. Beneath them lay a worn photograph of me from our wedding day, its edges frayed as if it had been touched 1,000 times in secret. Just as my fingers brushed the first letter, my own phone shrieked in my hand, a call from an unknown number. I answered, my voice a ghost of itself, only to hear a panicked voice on the other end. "Mrs. Sterling? This is the security detail at the bridge. There's been an accident. Your husband's car. It went over the railing." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto the cold marble floor with a sound that echoed like a skeletal snap through the empty, vaulted kitchen. The Tappan Zee Bridge. An accident. Over the railing. The words didn't compute. They were jagged shards of a nightmare refusing to fit into the reality I had been inhabiting only seconds prior. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the open briefcase, on that stack of letters dated for a future he was apparently never meant to see. My heart, which had been heavy with a decade's worth of resentment, now felt as though it were being hollowed out by a rusted blade. I didn't think. I didn't breathe. I grabbed my keys and ran, my heels clicking frantically against the driveway as I ignored the stinging New York rain that lashed against the Westchester landscape, turning the world into a blur of gray slate and mocking shadows. The drive to the bridge was a frantic, terrifying odyssey through a wall of water, my mind trapped in a horrific loop of Mark's trembling hands and the cruel, calculated words he had spat at me before leaving. A breath of fresh air. Was that meant to be his final legacy? A lie designed to keep me away from a tragedy he saw coming with the precision of a stopwatch? When I arrived, the scene was a chaotic symphony of pulsing red and blue lights reflecting off the slick, oil-stained asphalt. I pushed past the yellow police tape, my lungs burning with the metallic tang of rain and adrenaline, screaming his name until a state trooper caught me by the shoulders. "You can't go down there, ma'am," he shouted over the mechanical roar of a recovery crane, but I fought him with a feral strength I didn't know I possessed. I looked over the edge, down toward the churning, dark belly of the Hudson River, where the twisted metal of Mark's charcoal gray sedan was being hoisted upward. It looked like a crushed soda can, a pathetic coffin for a man who had once ruled boardrooms with a single glance. As the car broke the surface, the floodlights caught something that stopped my heart cold. Resting on the dashboard, held in place by the shattered remains of the windshield, was a small, navy blue velvet jeweler's box. It wasn't a business merger he was finalizing with Elena. It was a desperate, final attempt to bridge the canyon between us, a gap he had spent 2 years widening with his own hands, just to save me from the fallout of his end. They wouldn't let me near him. They bundled me into the back of an ambulance, wrapping me in a scratchy, gray wool blanket that smelled of salt and industrial disinfectant. My mind was a hurricane of contradictions. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the single letter I had managed to snatch from the briefcase before the world collapsed. My fingers, slick with rain and trembling so hard I could barely grip the paper, struggled to tear the seal. It was dated for the day after our contract was officially set to expire. "Sarah," it began, the handwriting shaky and jagged, a stark departure from his usual bold, authoritative script. "If you are reading this, I am already a ghost in your life, just as I've tried to be for the last 2 years. You probably hate me. You probably think Elena is the reason I'm gone. Let her be the villain. Let her be the reason you walk away with your head held high instead of bowed in grief. I took this contract because I wanted to buy you a decade of security, but I stayed because I couldn't bear to leave you alone in the dark. I made you hate me so that my death would feel like a relief, not a tragedy." A sob erupted from deep within my marrow, a primal sound of agony that tore through the sterile quiet of the ambulance. He had been playing a role. The indifference, the thu ki Elena, the calculated coldness, it was all a meticulously choreographed execution of my love, designed to make my departure painless. He didn't want me to be a grieving widow. He wanted me to be a defiant divorcee with a heart full of spite instead of ashes. Just as the medic leaned in to check my vitals, a sharp ping erupted from my phone. It was a notification from our shared Citibank account, a scheduled, automated transfer that had just cleared at the exact moment the contract hit its expiration and $10 million. The memo line, written months in advance, simply read, "For the rest of your life, don't look back." But as I looked at the dark, unforgiving water below the bridge, I knew there was no looking forward. I wasn't free. I was a prisoner of a man who loved me enough to become my greatest enemy just to set me free. The sirens had faded into a dull, rhythmic throb in my ears as the ambulance doors hissed open at the Westchester Medical Center emergency bay. The transition from the rain-soaked bridge to the fluorescent, sterile glare of the hospital felt like being dragged from one circle of hell into another. I clutched the damp letter in my hand, Mark's confession, his suicide note to our love, as if it were the only thing keeping me anchored to the earth. The $10 million notification still glowed on my phone screen, a vulgar, luminous reminder of the price he had put on my freedom. I was a millionaire now. A wealthy woman whose husband was currently being wheeled into a trauma room with a crushed chest and a brain that had been short-circuiting for years under the weight of a secret I was never meant to carry. I sprinted through the double doors, my wet evening dress dripping onto the pristine linoleum, ignored by the nurses who had seen too much grief to be moved by one more woman in ruined silk. And there, standing in the middle of the waiting room, was Elena. She wasn't the triumphant mistress I had envisioned during those long, lonely nights of resentment. The woman who had been a breath of fresh air was now a hollowed-out shell, her face pale under the harsh LED lights and her eyes rimmed with a terrifying, bone-deep exhaustion. She wasn't wearing the designer clothes from the night before. She was in faded scrub bottoms and a wrinkled t-shirt, her hair matted with sweat and salt. When she saw me, she didn't flinch. She didn't look guilty. She looked relieved, as if she had been waiting for the moment the lie finally shattered. "He didn't make it to the appointment, did he?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper that barely rose above the hum of the hospital's air conditioning. I stopped a few feet from her, the anger I had spent months nurturing suddenly feeling heavy and useless, a weapon with no target. "Appointment? He's in surgery because he drove off a bridge, Elena. Because he was trying to get away from a life he hated. Because of you." I wanted to scream, to tear the truth out of her, but she simply shook her head and held out a heavy manila folder she had been clutching to her chest like a shield. "I'm not his mistress, Sarah. I'm his hospice coordinator," she said, the words hitting me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. I reached out to steady myself against a plastic chair, my breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. Elena stepped closer, her voice dropping to a tone of clinical pity that hurt more than Mark's insults ever had. "Mark didn't have an affair. He had a glioblastoma, a grade 4 brain tumor. He's known for 2 years. He hired me to manage his decline in secret because he was terrified of you seeing him wither away. He didn't want your last memory of him to be a man who couldn't remember his own name or control his own body." She opened the folder, forcing me to look at a series of MRI scans, horrific, shadowy blooms spreading across a ghostly white brain like ink in water. I touched the cold film of the scans, my fingers tracing the dark masses that had been eating away at the man I loved while I was busy complaining about his coldness. The room began to spin as the realization settled into my marrow. Every cold shoulder, every late night at the office that I assumed was a tryst, every cruel comment about my stale presence, it wasn't a betrayal of our vows. It was a brutal, self-sacrificing protection of them. He had turned himself into a monster so I wouldn't have to be a martyr to his decay. I thought of the $10 million, the letters, the blue velvet box on the dashboard. He had been racing against his own fading mind, trying to reach the finish line of our 10-year agreement before the tumor took his dignity and my future. I pushed past Elena, fueled by a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, and ran toward the surgical wing. I had to tell him I knew. I had to tell him that I didn't want the money or the freedom. I wanted the suffering, the ugly parts, the dying breaths. I wanted the truth. But as I reached the heavy swinging doors of the ICU, a code blue alarm began to wail, a high-pitched, mechanical scream that filled the hallway. A team of doctors rushed past me, and through the glass partition of room 402, I saw a doctor's hands rhythmically crushing Mark's chest, trying to bring back a man who had spent 2 years trying to leave. I pressed my palms against the glass, my muffled scream lost in the chaos, as I realized that the time I thought would fix us had finally, mercilessly, run out. The mechanical shriek of the code blue alarm felt like it was tearing through my very skull, vibrating in the marrow of my bones as I stood paralyzed against the cold, smudged glass of room 402. Through the frantic blur of white coats and blue scrubs, I watched the rhythmic, brutal percussion of chest compressions, each thrust a desperate, bone-cracking attempt to jumpstart a heart that Mark had spent years trying to silence for my sake. The silence of the hospital hallway was a vacuum, swallowing my screams, leaving only the sound of my palms slapping rhythmically against the glass. "Don't you dare," I whispered, my breath fogging the window, obscuring the sight of his pale, broken body. "Don't you dare leave me with this money and this lie, Mark Sterling!" But the monitors remained a flat, unwavering line of emerald light, a horizontal horizon that signaled the end of our world. Just as a doctor reached for the defibrillator paddles for one final, hopeless surge, a hand settled on my shoulder. It was Elena again, her touch surprisingly firm despite her own visible trembling. "You need to step away, Sarah," she murmured, her voice thick with a weary kind of authority that suggested she had played this part in his script many times before. "He made me promise that if it came to this, I wouldn't let you see the struggle. He wanted you to remember him standing tall, not breaking under a doctor's hands." I whipped around, my eyes wild with a mixture of grief and a new, burning resentment. He doesn't get to decide that anymore. He doesn't get to curate my pain like it's some corporate merger. I tried to shove past her, but my strength failed me, and I collapsed into one of the rigid plastic chairs in the hallway, my ruined silk dress billowing around me like the wings of a fallen bird in a puddle of sterile light. Elena sat beside me, silent for a long moment, before reaching into her bag and pulling out a second manila envelope, smaller and heavier than the first. "There's more, Sarah. The $10 million wasn't just an inheritance. It was the settlement from a class action lawsuit against the pharmaceutical company that manufactured the chemicals his father's factory used, the same toxins that likely caused his tumor. He spent the last 3 years of his life in a brutal legal war to win that blood money for you, secretly, so you'd never have to work a day in your life once he was gone. He traded his final scraps of energy for your financial security. I stared at the envelope, but I didn't take it. The weight of his love was becoming a physical burden, a crushing mountain of gold and sacrifice that made me feel like the smallest, most selfish person on earth. I thought back to every time I had accused him of being obsessed with work, of being a cold-hearted capitalist who cared more about his bottom line than his wife. Every late night I assumed he was at the office with a mistress. He was actually in a deposition or a chemo chair, fighting a battle on 2 fronts just to ensure my comfort in a future he knew he wouldn't share. My mind raced back to the blue velvet box on the dashboard of his sunken car. "The ring," I choked out, looking at Elena. "I saw a box. In the car." Elena's eyes softened, and for the first time, a tear escaped her stoic mask. "That wasn't just a ring, Sarah. Today was the day he was going to tell you everything. He had a flight booked for both of you to a clinic in Switzerland, not for a vacation, but for a final Hail Mary surgery that had a 5% chance of success. He was going to give you the choice, to leave with the money and the divorce, or to stay and risk your heart on a 5% chance. He was so sure you'd choose the money because of how much he'd made you hate him. He was terrified that if you stayed and he died on that table, you'd never recover from the grief. The irony was a bitter poison in my mouth. He had spent years building a wall of hate, only to realize at the very last second that he couldn't bear to die without me knowing he had never stopped being the man I married. He was racing to the bridge to get to me, to offer me the ring and the truth, but the tumor or the sheer exhaustion of his own deception had finally taken the wheel. Inside the room, the frantic energy suddenly evaporated, replaced by the heavy, solemn stillness of defeat. The doctor stepped back, his shoulders slumping as he glanced at his watch. "Time of death, 8:42 a.m., he said, his voice barely audible through the glass. The words felt like a gavel coming down on my life. Mark was gone. He had won the legal war, secured the fortune, and successfully executed the most painful lie in history, only to lose the one thing he actually wanted, a single hour of being loved as the man he truly was. I reached out and took the envelope from Elena, my fingers brushing against the cold clinical paper, and realized that my life was now a vast, gilded cage, built by the hands of a man I had spent my final years despising. The walk out of the hospital felt like a descent into an ice-cold abyss, the $10 million settlement envelope tucked under my arm like a slab of lead. I didn't drive. I couldn't. Elena had arranged for a car to take me home, a silent, suffocating journey through the rain-slicked streets of Westchester that felt like a funeral procession for a ghost. When I finally pushed open the heavy oak doors of our mansion, the silence that greeted me wasn't the peaceful quiet of a home. It was the hollow, mocking ring of a cathedral built for a god who had already left. The scent of the Blue Mountain coffee I had brewed that morning still clung to the air, a spectral reminder of the man who had stood in this kitchen only hours ago, hiding his trembling hands and his breaking heart behind a mask of charcoal gray indifference. I moved through the house like a ghost, my ruined silk dress trailing across the marble floors until I reached the master bedroom. There, sitting on the edge of the bed, was the small, damp evidence bag the police had handed me. Inside was the blue velvet box, recovered from the twisted wreckage of the car. My hands shook so violently the plastic bag rattled as I struggled with the seal. When the velvet box finally sat in my palm, it felt warm, as if it still carried the phantom heat of Mark's touch in his final, panicked seconds. I clicked it open, expecting a diamond, a symbol of the new beginning he had promised to offer. But what I found shattered the last of my composure. It wasn't a new ring. It was my original wedding band, the one I had tucked into a drawer 3 years ago when the coldness between us became unbearable. He had stolen it. He had been carrying it over his heart all this time. Tucked behind the silk lining of the box was a tiny, folded slip of paper, yellowed at the edges and damp from the river water. I unfolded it with bated breath, recognizing the messy, frantic scrawl of a man whose brain was already betraying him. "Sarah, if you're reading this, it means I wasn't brave enough to say it to your face. The 10-year contract was never about business. It was the only way I knew how to keep you close while I figured out how to save you from the man I was becoming. If you want to go, the money is yours. But if you're still here, Check the floorboard under the piano. Please." I didn't wait. I ran down the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force it felt like it would crack. The grand piano stood in the corner of the darkened music room, a silent witness to a decade of unspoken words. I knelt on the hardwood floor, my fingernails clawing at the edge of the decorative molding until a section of the floorboard gave way with a groan of protesting wood. Underneath lay a leather-bound journal, its cover etched with my initials. As I opened it, the reality of Mark's betrayal finally collapsed upon me like a mountain. The pages weren't filled with business strategies or Elena's contact info, they were filled with us. Every single day of the last 2 years was documented not in dates, but in symptoms and sacrifices. Day 412, lost feeling in my left hand today. Sarah tried to hold it while we watched a movie, and I had to pull away, pretending I was annoyed. I saw the rejection in her eyes. It's working. She's starting to hate me. It's better this way. I turned the page, my tears blurring the ink. Day 600. The headache was so blinding I almost collapsed at dinner. She was wearing that blue dress I love. I called her stale, just to make her leave the room so she wouldn't see me seize. I cried for an hour after she shut the door. God, let her hate me enough that my death feels like a promotion, not a loss. The air in the room felt thin, insufficient. I realized then that every night I had spent crying myself to sleep, convinced he was in the arms of another woman, he was just on the other side of the wall, documenting his own agonizing decay and his desperate attempts to make me loathe him. He hadn't just sacrificed his life, he had sacrificed his soul, his reputation, and his very memory in my heart, all to ensure that when the end came, I wouldn't be the one shattered on the floor. He had turned himself into a villain to become my silent savior. I reached the final entry, dated only yesterday. The surgery is tomorrow. 5% chance. If I don't make it, Sarah will be the richest, most beautiful divorcee in New York. She'll never know I spent my last conscious breath whispering her name. I collapsed against the piano. The journal clutched to my chest. A $1 million widow in a house full of beautiful, expensive lies. I was just about to scream into the empty house when the doorbell rang a sharp, insistent sound that shattered the stillness. I looked at the security monitor and felt the world tilt again. It was Elena, her face streaked with tears, but she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, looking pale and terrified, was a 7-year-old boy I had never seen before, a boy with Mark's unmistakable, piercing blue eyes and the same stubborn set to his jaw. The doorbell's chime echoed through the hollow halls of the mansion like a death knell, pulling me from the wreckage of the music room floor. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, still clutching Mark's journal against my chest as if it were his very heart. When I opened the massive oak door, the damp New York air rushed in, smelling of ozone and wet pavement. Elena stood there, her shoulders slumped under the weight of an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. But it was the boy standing beside her who stole the breath from my lungs. He was no older than 7, wearing a small navy blue raincoat, staring at me with the exact same icy azure gaze that had looked at me with simulated coldness for the last 2 years. The resemblance wasn't just in his eyes, it was in the stubborn set of his jaw and the way he stood with his hands tucked into his pockets, mirroring a man who was now lying on a cold steel table in the city morgue. My mind, already frayed by the day's revelations, spun into a dark, frantic place. Was this the final betrayal? Was this a secret family Mark had kept in the shadows while I played the role of the devoted, invisible wife? "Who is he, Elena?" I asked, my voice cracking, a jagged edge of the old resentment resurfacing through my grief. I wanted to scream, to demand to know how many more layers of lies I had to peel back. But Elena didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick legal folder, placing it on the foyer table alongside the boy's small backpack. "This is Leo," she said softly, her voice trembling. "And no, Sarah, he's not the result of an affair. He's the reason Mark signed that contract with you 10 years ago. He's the reason Mark fought so hard to stay alive until today." She guided the boy inside, and I watched as Leo stayed silent, his gaze wandering up toward the grand staircase with a look of quiet expectation, as if he were waiting for a man who would never come down again. Elena led me into the kitchen, the place where my morning had begun in such bitter silence, and sat the boy down with a glass of milk before pulling me into the pantry hallway. "Mark didn't just inherit a factory, Sarah. He inherited a tragedy, she whispered. Before he met you, Mark's sister died from the same toxins that eventually caused his tumor. She left behind a newborn Leo. Mark knew even then that his own health was a ticking time bomb. He saw the medical reports. He knew the Sterling family legacy was a death sentence. She paused, her eyes shimmering with a pity that made me want to wither. He didn't marry you because he needed a housekeeper. He married you because he saw your heart, and he knew you were the only person in this world strong enough to raise this boy once he was gone. But he couldn't just ask you. He was terrified that if you knew the truth, the debt, the illness, the orphaned child, you'd stay out of pity, trapped by duty, rather than love. He wanted to buy you 10 years of a normal life before the storm hit. I leaned against the wall, the air in my lungs feeling insufficient. Every time I had Oan Trock Mark for not wanting children, every time I had cried because I thought he was too selfish to share a life with me, he was actually protecting Leo and protecting me from the burden of Leo's future until he had secured the fortune to back it up. He had played the villain to save me from being a martyr. I looked over at Leo, who was now tracing the patterns on the marble island with his finger, the exact same subconscious habit Mark had when he was deep in thought. The boy wasn't a symbol of betrayal. He was Mark's last act of faith in me. I realized then that the $10 million wasn't for me to run away with, it was for us to survive with. Mark had gambled everything on the hope that when the mask finally fell, I would see the boy's eyes and understand the sacrifice. I walked back into the kitchen and knelt on the floor beside Leo. For the first time, the tears that fell weren't for my own wasted years, but for the man who loved me so much he was willing to let me hate him just so I wouldn't be alone when the silence came. "Hi, Leo," I whispered, reaching out to touch his small, cold hand. The boy looked at me, a small, sad smile tugging at his lips. "I know who you are," he said. "Uncle Mark said you were the one who was going to save us when he had to go away." The warmth of Leo's small, trembling hand in mine was the only thing keeping me from drifting away into the abyss of my own grief as the weight of Mark's 10-year deception settled into my soul. But the universe wasn't done screaming at me. Barely an hour had passed since Elena brought Leo through the door when the peaceful sanctuary of the mansion was shattered by the aggressive glare of headlights cutting through the New York rain. A black Cadillac Escalade screeched to a halt in the driveway, followed by another, their tires spitting gravel against the manicured lawn. I recognized the silhouettes immediately. Mark's cousin, Julian, and his predatory sister, Beatrice, people Mark had spent a decade describing as locusts in tailored suits. They didn't even wait to be buzzed in. They used their own emergency keys, a relic of the Sterling family's obsession with control. They burst into the foyer, the smell of damp wool, expensive tobacco, and unearned entitlement filling the air. Beatrice didn't even look at me. Her eyes were already scanning the grand staircase and the original war holes on the walls, mentally slapping auction tags on our life. "Sarah, darling, we heard the news." "What a colossal tragedy," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a rehearsed, hollow grief that didn't even brush against her cold eyes. She walked over to the marble side table and picked up a crystal vase Mark had bought me in Paris, turning it over to check the maker's mark as if she already owned it. Julian stepped forward, his chest puffed out with the arrogance of a man who had spent his life living off family dividends. "We're here to handle the transition, Sarah," Mark was. Brilliant, but unstable. "We know about his accident, and frankly, we know his mental state has been precarious for months. Since your contract expires this week, your legal claim to the Sterling estate is, at best, a fantasy. We've already briefed our probate attorneys." He then looked over my shoulder, his lip curling in disgust as his gaze landed on Leo. "And who is this? Another one of Mark's charity cases? I hope you didn't think you could just drag a stray child in here to guilt-trip us into a bigger settlement." The blood in my veins turned to liquid nitrogen. But it wasn't fear, it was a cold, sharp rage that Mark had spent 10 years teaching me how to weaponize. For a decade, I had been the invisible wife, the woman who stood quietly in the shadows while Mark played the villain. But as I looked at these vultures, I realized that Mark hadn't just been protecting me from his illness. He had been protecting the kingdom from them. The 10-year contract wasn't a cage. It was a fortress with a drawbridge only I could lower. I stood up slowly, stepping in front of the kitchen doorway to shield Leo, whose small hand tightened around my fingers in a silent plea for protection. I felt the $10 million check in my pocket, the blood money Mark had won from the pharmaceutical giants, and I realized it was my war chest. "You're remarkably misinformed, Julian," I said, my voice coming out with a steady, lethal calm that made Beatrice freeze. I walked over to the foyer table and snatched the crystal vase out of her hands, slamming it back down with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. Mark didn't leave anything to debate. The contract didn't just end our marriage, it triggered a final, irrevocable trust that was signed and notarized 3 months ago when Mark was still legally of sound mind. As of 8:42 a.m. today, I am not just the executor of the Sterling estate, I am the sole legal guardian of Leo, Mark's nephew and his primary heir. And per the terms of the poison pill addendum, Mark added, if any member of the Sterling family attempts to contest this will or even sets foot on this property without my written consent, the entire trust is immediately liquidated and donated to the very litigation fund Mark used to sue your friends in the pharma industry. I stepped into Julian's personal space, watching the color drain from his face as the reality of his defeat set in. You have 60 seconds to leave before the security detail. Mark paid for 3 years in advance removes you by force. And if you ever refer to this boy as a charity case again, I will use every cent of that $10 million to make sure you spend the rest of your life in a courtroom until you're wearing rags. They retreated, muttering pathetic threats that sounded like the whimpers of beaten dogs, their heels clicking rapidly away on the marble they would never touch again. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut, I felt the house exhale. The silence didn't feel like a tomb anymore, it felt like a clearing after a storm. I turned back to the kitchen, where Leo was watching me with wide, shimmering eyes. He didn't look terrified anymore. He looked like he had finally found the anchor Mark promised him. I walked back to him and knelt, not as a widow or a divorcee, but as a protector. "They're gone, Leo," I whispered, stroking his hair. "And they're never coming back. This is our house now." I realized then that Mark hadn't just given me money. He had given me a purpose worth more than any inheritance. He had spent 10 years making me strong enough to fight the battles he knew he wouldn't be around to finish. The silence following the departure of the Sterling vultures was heavy, but it was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the first victory. I spent the next hour settling Leo into the guest suite, watching as he carefully arranged a few small plastic dinosaurs on the nightstand relics of a childhood spent in the shadows of Mark's grand, tragic plan. Once he drifted into an exhausted sleep, clutching a tattered blanket that smelled faintly of the same sandalwood cologne Mark wore, I found myself drawn to the one place I had been forbidden from entering for 3 years, Mark's private study at the far end of the West Wing. For 36 months, that room had been a black hole in our marriage, the place where he disappeared for late-night conferences that I now knew were spent in the agonizing company of medical reports and legal depositions. I stood before the heavy mahogany door, my hand trembling as I turned the handle. I expected the room to smell of cold corporate secrets, but as I stepped inside, the only scent was the stale, sterile odor of a hospital room masked by the faint aroma of aged paper and my own favorite perfume, which lingered on a scarf he had kept on his desk. The study was a shrine to a man who had been fighting a dual war. One wall was covered in complex legal charts targeting the pharmaceutical giants, while the other, the one directly facing his chair, was pinned with every card and note I had ever sent him over the last decade, even the grocery lists I'd scribbled on. In the center of the room sat his desk, pristine and cold. On top of it, angled perfectly toward his seat, was a small, silver digital recorder. I sat in his leather chair, the seat still holding the ghostly warmth and shape of a man who had withered away while I watched with angry, blinded eyes. I pressed play, and for a moment, the only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of someone in immense pain, followed by the clink of a pill bottle. Then, Mark's voice filled the room, not the sharp, biting tone he had used to push me away, but the soft, melodic baritone of the man I had married 10 years ago. "Sarah," the recording began, followed by a sharp intake of breath and a muffled cough. "It's 3 a.m. I just watched you through the cracked door while you were crying in the hallway. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't even reach out to pull you in. If you're hearing this, It means the bridge took me before the tumor could, or maybe the surgery in Switzerland was just another 5% lie I told myself to keep going. I need you to know the one thing I couldn't put in the letters because seeing it in ink made it too real. There was a long pause, the sound of a glass clinking against the desk, and then a shaky, self-deprecating laugh. The contract. The 10-year limit. It wasn't just to buy you security, Sarah. I was selfish. I knew, based on the doctor's initial projections, that 10 years was exactly how long I had before the symptoms would become a horror show. I made you sign it because I wanted to own every last second of my real life with you. I wanted to steal 10 years of your beauty and your light before I turned into the monster you've seen lately. I am the thief, Sarah. I stole your youth because I couldn't bear to face the darkness without knowing you were in the next room. I felt the air leave my lungs, my fingers digging into the leather armrests. He wasn't just a martyr, he was a human, terrified and desperate. He had manipulated our entire marriage to ensure he wasn't alone during his countdown, weaving a web of cruelty at the end just to absolve me of the guilt he knew would haunt me. But there's a safe behind the portrait of us in the library, the voice continued, growing weaker, almost a whisper. The code is the 12th of June 2014, the day I first saw you in that rainstorm. Inside is a folder. It's not about money or Leo. It's the truth about why I never let us have a child of our own. It's the only thing I truly regret, Sarah. I wanted to give you a piece of me that wouldn't die, but I couldn't risk giving you a piece that was already broken. The recording cut off with a sudden, jarring click, leaving me in a silence so profound I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears. I realized then that my 10 years hadn't been a waste. They had been a final, desperate gift to a man who was drowning. I stood up, the silver recorder clutched to my chest, and headed toward the library. My marriage was over. My husband was dead, but the ghost of Mark Sterling was still talking, and he was about to reveal a secret that would change the way I looked at my own body forever. The library was a chamber of shadows, the towering shelves of leather-bound books standing like silent sentinels watching my every move. I approached the grand portrait of us that hung above the fireplace, a painting from our second anniversary, where Mark's eyes were still full of life, and his smile hadn't yet been practiced in front of a mirror to hide his pain. With trembling hands, I swung the heavy frame aside, revealing the cold, gray steel of the wall safe. My fingers fumbled as I punched in the numbers he had whispered through the digital recorder. The 12th of June 2014, the day of the rainstorm. The day a young, ambitious lawyer had offered his umbrella to a girl standing drenched on a Manhattan street corner. The safe clicked open with a heavy, mechanical finality, exhaling a puff of stale air that smelled of old ink and ozone. Inside, there were no bundles of cash or glittery jewels. There was only a single, thick medical file and a small, translucent vial containing a sample of something frozen in time. I carried the file to the large mahogany reading table, my breath hitching as I flipped open the first page. It wasn't a report for Mark. It was a genetic screening for me, dated 8 years ago. At the time, Mark had insisted we both get routine physicals before trying for a baby, or so I had thought. I remembered the disappointment when he told me, weeks later, that the doctors said it wasn't the right time for him, that his stress levels were too high. I had spent years blaming myself, questioning my own femininity, wondering if I was the reason we remained a house of two. But as I read the documents, the room began to spin. The reports showed that I carried a rare, recessive genetic marker, the same one that had killed his sister and was currently ravaging his brain. If we had conceived a child naturally, there was a 75% chance that our baby would have been born with the same ticking time bomb in their skull. Mark hadn't been avoiding fatherhood because he was selfish. He had been protecting a life that didn't even exist yet from a suffering he knew all too well. I turned to the back of the file and found a series of receipts from a fertility clinic in Boston, along with a signed consent form for pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. Mark had spent years and hundreds of thousands of dollars working with specialists to find a way to clean the genetic line. The vial in the safe wasn't a sample of his illness. It was a cryopreserved embryo, the only one that had survived the rigorous screening process, free from the Sterling curse. A sticky note was attached to the vial in his jagged, late-stage handwriting, "The only piece of me that is truly whole, Sarah. I didn't want you to have to choose between a child and my life, so I waited until I knew I was leaving. If you're reading this, He's ready to come home. You don't have to be alone." A sob tore through me, so violent it felt like my ribs were cracking. I collapsed onto the floor, the medical files scattering around me like fallen leaves. Every business trip to Boston, every cold night he spent away from my bed, he wasn't with Elena or any other woman. He was in a lab, staring through a microscope at a tiny cluster of cells, fighting a war against his own DNA to give me a future he would never see. He had allowed me to feel inadequate, allowed me to hate him for his lack of interest in a family, all to spare me the agony of watching our child die before they even lived. He had carried the weight of my resentment like a crown of thorns, never once flinching, never once letting the truth slip through his teeth. I looked up at the portrait of the man who had been my husband, my stranger, and my silent guardian. The 10-year contract wasn't just a settlement, it was a gestation period. He had used every second of that decade to purge the darkness from our lineage, ensuring that the boy sleeping upstairs, Leo, and the potential life in this vial would have a world built on the foundations of his own destruction. I realized then that I wasn't just a widow or a millionaire. I was the keeper of his last hope. I reached out and touched the cool glass of the vial, the silence of the library no longer feeling empty, but filled with the heartbeat of a man who loved me more than his own life. The cool glass of the vial felt like a spark of life against my palm, a tiny frozen miracle that stood as the ultimate testament to Mark's silent, agonizing devotion. I sat there on the library floor, surrounded by the scattered papers of my own genetic history, feeling the immense weight of a love that had preferred to be hated rather than to be the cause of my ruin. But the universe, it seemed, had no intention of letting me grieve in peace. Just as I was beginning to process the magnitude of Mark's sacrifice, a sound tore through the heavy stillness of the mansion, a dull, rhythmic thumping coming from the guest suite upstairs, followed by a sharp, guttural gasp that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the sound of a child having a nightmare, it was the sound of a body losing control. I scrambled to my feet, the medical file clutched in my hand, and sprinted up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, primitive rhythm. When I burst into the guest suite, the scene was a nightmare carved out of the very darkness I had just read about. Leo wasn't sleeping. He was on the floor beside the bed, his small frame caught in the violent, electric grip of a grand mal seizure. His eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites, and his hands were clenched into tiny, pale claws. "Leo!" I screamed, lunging toward him, but my mind suddenly flashed back to the medical reports I had just been holding. The Sterling curse. This wasn't just a random medical emergency. This was the ticking time bomb Mark had spent his final years trying to defuse. Panic threatened to swallow me whole, but then I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me, the ghost of Mark's pragmatism settling into my bones. I realized then why he had left the files in the safe, why he had documented every symptom, every dosage, and every emergency protocol. He hadn't just left me a fortune, he had left me a manual for survival. I rolled Leo onto his side just as the manual had instructed, clearing his airway and checking the clock. My hands, which had been shaking all day, were suddenly steady. I ran back to the library for the hidden medical kit Mark had mentioned in the journal, the one he'd kept just in case the shadows moved too fast. Inside, I found the emergency anticonvulsants, preloaded and labeled with Leo's name. As I administered the medication, watching the violent tremors in his small body begin to subside into exhausted shudders, I felt a terrifying connection to the man I had lost. I was doing exactly what Mark had done for 10 years, holding back the darkness with sheer will and calculated precision. I called 911, my voice steady as I recited Leo's specific genetic markers and the medication I had just administered, using terms I didn't even know I knew until this very moment. The paramedics arrived minutes later, their heavy boots thumping on the marble I had so recently defended from Mark's relatives. As they loaded Leo onto the stretcher, one of the medics looked at me with a mix of surprise and respect. "You saved him, ma'am. Most people would have just panicked, but you knew exactly what to do." I looked down at my hands, stained with the dust of the safe and the salt of my own tears, and realized that I was no longer the woman who had signed that contract 10 years ago. I was the guardian Mark had meticulously trained through his own cruelty. He had pushed me away so that I would learn to stand alone. He had made me hate him so that I wouldn't be paralyzed by grief when the real battles began. As the ambulance sped away with Leo Elena already on her way to meet us at the hospital, I stood on the front steps of the mansion, the rain finally tapering off into a cold, gray mist. I looked out at the sprawling estate, the gilded cage that now felt like a fortress under my command. I wasn't just a widow holding a check for $10 million. I was the mother of a child who carried Mark's eyes, and the keeper of a vial that carried his soul. The contract was over. The silence had been broken, and the real work of the Sterling legacy was just beginning. I reached into my pocket and touched the silver recorder, feeling a surge of defiant strength. Mark had spent a decade protecting me from the truth, but now it was my turn to protect the future he had died to create. I wouldn't just survive. I would ensure that the Sterling name finally stood for something more than a tragedy. The flashbulbs of the paparazzi outside the Sterling Tower were a frantic strobe light, but I didn't blink. I walked across the polished granite lobby of the corporate headquarters, the rhythmic strike of my stilettos against the floor sounding like a series of dry, lethal hammer strikes. I was no longer wearing the ruined silk dress of that fateful night. I was encased in a bespoke black power suit, tailored with a severity that commanded the air around me, a suit Mark had hidden in a private vault, waiting for the day I would finally need my armor. Beside me, Elena marched with a thick, leather-bound dossier, her face no longer showing exhaustion but the cold, sharpened edge of a seasoned strategist. We weren't here for a memorial service. We were here for a hostile takeover. As the massive oak doors of the boardroom swung open, 12 pairs of stunned eyes looked up. At the head of the table, Julian sat in Mark's chair, twirling a pen with the unearned confidence of a man who thought the king was dead and the gates were unguarded. "Sarah? What the hell are you doing here? This is an internal meeting for strategic shareholders," Julian said, standing up as his face shifted from arrogance to a pale, flickering confusion. He tried to muster a condescending smirk, but his eyes were glued to the dossier in my hand. I didn't sit. I stood at the opposite end of the long mahogany table and placed Mark's silver digital recorder onto the marble surface. "This meeting is legally void without the presence of the individual holding 51% of the voting shares. Julian," I said, my voice coming out with a resonant, lethal calm that caused a vacuum of silence to swallow the room. Beatrice, sitting next to her brother, let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh. 51%? "Mark signed a divorce settlement with you, Sarah. You're just a paid-off ghost. Don't let the grief go to your head." I offered her a thin, cold smile, the kind of smile Mark had spent 10 years teaching me without ever saying a word. I slid the dossier across the table, the pages containing the horrific truth Mark had spent his final 3 years meticulously documenting. "Mark wasn't just sick, Julian. He was being methodically liquidated," I declared, my words hitting the room like a timed explosive. Murmurs erupted, but I held up a hand for silence. The $10 million settlement everyone assumed was a divorce payout was actually a paper trail of a dirty transaction. "Julian, you brokered a deal with our competitors to leak toxic industrial chemicals into the Sterling manufacturing line, the same chemicals that accelerated Mark's tumor, all to tank the stock price so you could stage a buyout. And it was you who paid a mechanic to bypass the safety sensors on the charcoal gray sedan 2 nights ago." Julian's face went the color of ash. He stammered a denial, but Elena had already connected her laptop to the room's monitors, displaying a cascade of encrypted emails and wire transfer logs. Mark knew he was dying, but he was never going to die alone without dragging the traitors down with him. "Our 10-year contract was never meant to end a marriage," I continued, each word a nail in their coffin. It was a legal trap. For a decade, Mark was quietly transferring personal assets and corporate control into a blind trust under the name of Leo Sterling, with me as the sole irrevocable guardian and executor until the boy reaches maturity. "Julian Beatrice, you haven't just lost your inheritance, you've lost your freedom." At that exact moment, the boardroom doors opened again, but it wasn't a secretary. It was a team of detectives from the NYPD. I watched as the handcuffs clicked around Julian's wrists, watching the total collapse of the vultures who had mistaken my silence for weakness for 10 long years. When the room finally cleared, leaving only me and Elena, I walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the chaotic pulse of Manhattan. The digital recorder sat on the table, holding the last echo of Mark's voice. I realized then that Mark's grand design wasn't just to protect me and Leo. It was to forge me into a version of himself, resolute, calculated, and unafraid to strike. He had used 10 years to turn a naive girl into a woman who could protect his legacy with a heart of iron. Based on the intense journey of Mark and Sarah over their 10-year contract, here are the profound life lessons derived from the story, presented in English. 1. The mask of the villain often hides a guardian. The greatest revelation in Mark's journey is that true sacrifice sometimes requires being hated. Mark chose to play the role of the cold, unfaithful husband to ensure that Sarah's departure would be fueled by liberation and spite rather than the soul-crushing weight of grief and pity. The lesson: do not be quick to judge someone based on their surface-level coldness. Sometimes, the people who push us away the hardest are the ones trying to save us from the shrapnel of their own destruction. 2. Silence as a shield versus communication as a cure. Mark's 10-year silence created a hell of suspicion for Sarah. While his intent was noble, it raises a haunting question. Do we have the right to deprive our partners of the chance to face the storm by our side? The lesson: while honesty can be agonizing, deception, even with the best intentions, leaves psychological scars that never truly heal. However, in extreme cases of survival and corporate warfare, silence can be the only effective defensive strategy. San, pain as a forge for strength. The 10-year contract, which Sarah initially viewed as a gilded cage, turned out to be a decade-long training ground. Mark used that time to harden Sarah, transforming a naive girl into an iron queen capable of staring down corporate vultures and raising an orphan child alone. The lesson: the pressures and heartbreaks in a relationship aren't always meant to break you. Sometimes, they are meticulously designed to prepare you for the battles you don't yet know are coming. 4. Love is an architecture of responsibility. Mark didn't just love with emotion, he loved with clinical, strategic foresight. He secured the finances, $10 million, the legal fortress, the trust fund, and the successor, Leo. The lesson: real love is synonymous with protection. It is the act of ensuring that even when you are gone, the person you love remains safe, dignified, and empowered. It is about building a world for them to live in after yours has ended. 5. Empowerment through facing the truth. Sarah only truly gained control of her destiny when she stopped running from the pain and started opening the safes, reading the journals, and walking into the boardroom. The lesson: growth begins the moment you stop being a victim of your circumstances and start becoming the investigator of your truth. Only by facing the rawest, darkest parts of your history can you find the strength to change your future. Conclusion: the sterling legacy. This story serves as a reminder that love is not always bright and beautiful. Sometimes it is as gray as ash and as dark as a secret. But if its foundation is total devotion, then even in death, that love leaves a radiant legacy for the one left behind.